Right now, at this very moment, somewhere in the Nevada desert, there's a question being asked that nobody can answer. Not because the answer is too complex, but because the question itself has been twisted, reshaped, and transformed so many times that we've forgotten what we were originally asking. For over 3 decades, one story has dominated every conversation about Area 51. It's been repeated in documentaries, debated in forums, and accepted as fact by millions. But here's what almost nobody realizes. The most famous detail about Area 51's hidden infrastructure was never actually part of the original story at all. It was added later, piece by piece, assumption by assumption, until fiction became indistinguishable from testimony. Today, we're going to trace that transformation step by step, and what you'll discover might change everything you thought you knew about secrecy, belief, and the stories we tell ourselves when answers are deliberately withheld.
Before we can understand what was never said, we need to understand the environment that made unsaid things so powerful. Area 51 didn't become mysterious because of what happened there. It became mysterious because of what was deliberately not explained. This distinction is crucial, and it's where most investigations go wrong from the very beginning. When the Central Intelligence Agency finally acknowledged the existence of Groom Lake in 2013, they weren't revealing a secret. They were confirming what aviation enthusiasts, defense contractors, and half of Nevada already knew. The base existed. Aircraft were tested there. Secrecy was maintained. What made this acknowledgement significant wasn't the information it provided, but rather what it demonstrated about the nature of institutional silence. For nearly 60 years, the government had maintained a specific kind of quiet, not the silence of concealment, but the silence of controlled disclosure. They never denied, they simply never confirmed. This creates a psychological condition that researchers call informational asymmetry, and it's one of the most powerful tools for shaping public perception ever developed. When people know they're missing information but don't know how much, their minds begin filling gaps automatically. The human brain is uncomfortable with unresolved systems. We need narratives to have structure, causes to have effects, and mysteries to have solutions. When official channels refuse to provide that structure, we construct it ourselves. Area 51 operated in this space for decades. Workers flew in on unmarked aircraft, supplies arrived in covered trucks, experimental craft were tested under cover of darkness. None of this required exotic explanations. It simply required procedure, compartmentalization, and the understanding that secrecy isn't about hiding everything, it's about controlling interpretation. A civilian sees a truck on a highway and sees a truck. A pilot sees an aircraft on approach and sees an aircraft. Meaning is withheld not by hiding the object, but by fragmenting the context so completely that no single observer can assemble the full picture. This was the world Bob Lazar entered when he came forward in 1989. He didn't step into a vacuum of information. He stepped into an environment already shaped by decades of institutional silence, where the absence of answers had become as meaningful as answers themselves. The stage was set, the audience was primed, and what happened next would demonstrate how easily speculation hardens into assumed truth when the conditions are right.
Let's establish something with absolute precision before we go any further. When Bob Lazar first appeared on Las Vegas television in the spring of 1989, sitting partially in shadow with his identity obscured, he made specific claims about specific things. He described being recruited to work at a facility he called S4, located south of Groom Lake near Papoose Lake. He described compartmentalized access, strict security protocols, and exposure to technology he could not explain. He described being transported to the site with windows blacked out, prevented from seeing his route, monitored constantly, and warned explicitly about the consequences of disclosure. What he did not describe is equally important. He never claimed to have designed the craft he allegedly observed. He never claimed communication with non-human entities. He never claimed access to the full scope of any program, and, most critically for our purposes today, he never described tunnels, underground railways, or subterranean transport systems connecting facilities beneath the desert. Not in his initial interviews with investigative reporter George Knapp, not in his subsequent appearances, not in the 2018 Joe Rogan interview, not in the 2019 documentary. Never. This absence is not incidental. It's consistent across more than 30 years of recorded statements. When pressed about infrastructure in later interviews, Lazar defers. When asked about areas beyond his assignment, he declines to speculate. When confronted with interpretations he doesn't recognize, he distances himself from them. This restraint is one reason his account has remained difficult to categorize. He doesn't expand his claims over time. He doesn't retrofit his story to accommodate new theories. He simply repeats the same narrow testimony, sometimes to his own detriment. The details he did provide align closely with known Cold War security practices. Compartmentalization wasn't a flourish in his account, it was the central organizing principle. He described a working environment where knowledge was deliberately fragmented, where individual workers understood only their specific task, where access was controlled not through physical barriers alone, but through information restrictions. These practices were not exotic, they were standard procedure at classified facilities throughout the Cold War, documented in hundreds of declassified reports about programs from the U-2 to the A-12 to stealth aircraft development. Lazar spoke about being driven to the site, about badge systems and access corridors, about a culture defined by isolation. These elements resonate with documented practices, but they don't imply extraordinary infrastructure, they imply procedure. When listeners encountered his story, they heard secrecy and compartmentalization. What they inferred was something else entirely. They began asking reasonable questions. If there were multiple facilities, how were they connected? If large objects were being studied, how were they moved? If secrecy was paramount, how was visibility avoided? These questions didn't originate with Lazar. They originated with audiences trying to complete a narrative that felt unfinished. The transformation from testimony to mythology didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, organically, through a process so subtle that most people never noticed it occurring. In the early to mid-90s, several years after Lazar's initial interviews, Area 51 entered a new phase of public consciousness. It was no longer just an aviation secret whispered among defense contractors. It had become a cultural symbol, appearing in books, conferences, documentaries, and the early internet forums that were just beginning to reshape how information spread. During this period, researchers and enthusiasts encountered what seemed like a straightforward logistical problem embedded in Lazar's account. The problem was simple. If sensitive materials existed at multiple sites within restricted areas, how were they transported without exposure? This question is perfectly reasonable. It's the kind of practical consideration that serious investigators should ask. The issue isn't that the question was posed. The issue is what happened when no official answer arrived. In the absence of documentation, speculation filled the void. Early researchers proposed underground connections as a way to reconcile secrecy with movement. Initially, this was presented carefully, framed as possibility rather than certainty. Phrases like "some researchers believe" or "it has been suggested" appeared in early discussions. The language was cautious, the claims were qualified. But over time, something shifted. Possibility became suggestion. Suggestion became assumption. By the late 90s, the language had changed. What had once been phrased conditionally began appearing as declarative statements. Diagrams started circulating online depicting tunnels linking Groom Lake to Papoose Lake. These diagrams cited no primary sources. Many cited each other, creating a circular reference system that gave the appearance of corroboration without providing actual evidence. This is how unsupported ideas stabilize in the age of information. Not through proof, but through circulation. When an idea is repeated often enough across enough platforms, it begins to feel established. The human mind treats familiarity as a proxy for validity. We assume that widely known claims must have originated from somewhere credible, even when we can't identify that origin ourselves. The railway narrative benefited enormously from this dynamic. Another factor accelerated the theory's spread: the rise of commercial satellite imagery in the early 2000s. When platforms like Google Earth became publicly accessible, amateur analysts began examining terrain around Area 51 with unprecedented detail. They looked at shadows, discolorations, ridge lines, and geological features, searching for meaning in every variation. In many cases, entirely natural formations were reinterpreted as artificial. Straight lines became suspected entrances. Color variations became ventilation shafts. The absence of visible surface roads was taken as evidence of underground alternatives. This process has a name in cognitive psychology: apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. It's not deception. It's not even necessarily wrong. It's a natural human response to ambiguity, especially when the subject matter is already charged with secrecy and institutional distrust. The problem is that apophenia doesn't produce evidence, it produces interpretation. And when interpretation is repeated enough times without challenge, it begins functioning as evidence in collective memory. To understand why the Underground Railway theory persists despite lacking support, we need to understand how classified programs actually move hardware. This isn't speculation, this is documented practice, refined over decades of Cold War operations and described in hundreds of declassified reports. The fundamental principle is simple. Secrecy is maintained not through invisibility, but through procedure and compartmentalization. The goal isn't to prevent all observation, it's to prevent interpretation. During the 1940s and 50s, the United States military learned a critical lesson. The most vulnerable phase of any classified program wasn't testing or operation, it was movement. Equipment had to travel between manufacturers, test sites, bases, and storage facilities. Every mile created exposure. Every stop created witnesses. Every delay created questions. To manage this, the Department of Defense developed standardized methods emphasizing predictability, misdirection, and information control. One of the most common tools was the covered ground convoy. Sensitive cargo, often unrecognizable even if exposed, was moved at night under escort using unmarked trucks or trailers. Drivers were briefed only on their immediate task. Escort personnel were often unaware of the cargo's purpose. Routes were selected to avoid population centers when possible, but not always. When visibility couldn't be avoided, the strategy shifted from concealment to normalization. A truck that looks ordinary attracts less attention than one that looks secret. This principle appears repeatedly in classified logistics manuals. Nuclear weapons were moved this way. Prototype aircraft components were moved this way. Radar arrays, avionics packages, and propulsion test hardware followed the same model. Air transport was also used extensively, but contrary to popular belief, classified material doesn't always move in mysterious aircraft. More often, it's loaded onto standard military transports under controlled conditions. Cargo manifests are restricted, flight plans are routine. Only a small number of individuals understand the significance of what's being carried. This approach was used throughout the development of the U-2, the A-12, and later stealth programs. Components were manufactured in one location, assembled in another, tested in a third. At no point did any single group have a complete picture. This is compartmentalization replacing invisibility. The assumption that secrecy requires hiding everything underground fundamentally misunderstands how large organizations function. The goal is to prevent interpretation, not observation. From a logistics perspective, large-scale underground infrastructure like rail systems creates its own massive footprint. Rail requires power, maintenance, ventilation, access points, and personnel trained to operate and repair it. All of these create additional layers of exposure and documentation. They don't simplify secrecy, they complicate it exponentially. Historically, the military has avoided unnecessary complexity in classified logistics. The more moving parts a system has, the more people it involves. The more people involved, the harder secrecy becomes. Even in facilities that are heavily fortified underground, such as Cheyenne Mountain, rail systems are limited, internal, and well documented. They exist to move personnel or equipment within a known facility, not to connect secret sites across miles of terrain. There is no documented precedent for the United States constructing an extensive covert underground railway solely to move experimental hardware between unacknowledged facilities. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean it would be anomalous, expensive, and inconsistent with documented practices. The underground railway theory persists not because evidence supports it, but because it solves a psychological problem. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with unresolved systems. When a story introduces moving parts without showing how they connect, our minds automatically fill in the missing links. This isn't irrational, it's how our brains are designed to function. We need narratives to have structure. We need causes to have effects. We need mysteries to have solutions. When official answers are unavailable, we construct answers that feel structurally satisfying. An underground railway offers exactly that kind of satisfaction. It's coherent. It's orderly. It explains multiple mysteries simultaneously. It accounts for how materials could move unseen. It explains why no surface evidence exists. It explains why witnesses never crossed paths, and critically, it does all of this without requiring new characters or new evidence, only new infrastructure hidden beneath the surface, where it can't be easily verified or falsified. This makes the theory especially resilient. It occupies what researchers call a conceptual safe zone. It cannot fail because it never fully commits to specifics. Where exactly are the tunnels? How long are they? Who built them? When? With what budget? Operated by whom? Without answers to these questions, the theory cannot be disproven. But it also cannot be proven. It simply exists as an explanation that feels proportionate to the scale of secrecy people assume must be present. The theory also benefits from something called proximity bias. Papoose Lake lies close to Groom Lake, and proximity encourages assumption. When two locations exist near each other within restricted space, the human mind expects connection. Roads connect towns, tunnels connect buildings, railways connect hubs. Connection feels natural, but proximity alone does not imply linkage. Restricted airspace does not imply subterranean transit. These are inferences, not observations. Over time, however, repeated inference begins to feel observational. Media representation has reinforced this transformation powerfully. Documentaries, illustrations, and speculative diagrams have presented underground connections visually, often without explicit claims of proof. The language may remain cautious, but imagery carries authority. Once viewers see a tunnel drawn between two locations, the concept becomes anchored in memory. The brain processes visual information faster, retains it longer, and questions it less rigorously than verbal disclaimers. Many viewers remember the railway image, but forget the accompanying caveat that it's speculative. Another sustaining factor is association with real underground facilities. The United States undeniably operates extensive underground military infrastructure. Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, missile silos, and hardened command centers are all documented and acknowledged. Once a person accepts that underground construction exists, and it does, it becomes easier to accept additional underground systems even without direct evidence. This is conceptual spillover. The mistake isn't recognizing underground facilities. The mistake is assuming that because some exist for specific survivability purposes, all secret activity must also be underground and interconnected. Before accepting extraordinary explanations, responsible investigation requires exhausting ordinary ones. The anomalies surrounding Area 51 and the alleged S4 site don't necessarily require underground railways to explain them. Let's consider what conventional explanations might account for the observations without invoking hidden infrastructure. First, conventional surface logistics operating under restrictive protocols. In restricted ranges like the Nevada Test and Training Range, access is already severely limited. Roads are gated, airspace is closed, civilian presence is minimal. Under these conditions, surface transport doesn't need to be invisible. It only needs to be controlled. Vehicles traveling at night under escort on routes closed to the public can move sensitive material without drawing attention. The absence of witnesses isn't evidence of underground transport. It's a consequence of exclusion zones that have existed for decades. Second, misinterpretation of terrain and infrastructure. Southern Nevada is geologically complex. Dry lake beds, volcanic ridges, and erosion patterns produce linear features that can resemble artificial structures when viewed from above, especially in satellite imagery that compresses depth and exaggerates contrast. Shadows along ridgelines can appear as openings. Natural cuts in rock can resemble blast doors or tunnel entrances. Seasonal changes can alter surface coloration dramatically. None of these phenomena require construction, but all invite interpretation when observers expect concealment. Third, utility and support corridors rather than secret facilities. Even undeveloped military land often contains buried utilities, power lines, communication cables, water pipes, monitoring equipment. These systems require access points, maintenance roads, and protective structures that appear anomalous when divorced from their mundane function. A buried power conduit doesn't imply a tunnel network. A fenced utility area doesn't imply a hidden hangar. But when viewed through the lens of assumed secrecy, ordinary infrastructure acquires imagined purpose. Fourth, vibration or seismic activity reported near restricted zones. These sensations are sometimes interpreted as evidence of underground movement or machinery. However, the Nevada test site has a long history of seismic disturbance completely unrelated to transportation. Underground nuclear tests conducted during the Cold War fractured rock strata and altered ground stability across wide areas. Even decades later, the subsurface remains dynamic. Additionally, modern military ranges conduct seismic monitoring, explosive testing, and ground-penetrating experiments. Vibrations from these activities can travel significant distances through bedrock, producing sensations that feel localized but originate elsewhere. Fifth, psychological amplification within restricted environments. When individuals know they're operating near classified activities, their perception fundamentally changes. Ambiguity becomes meaningful, silence becomes suggestive, ordinary sounds are reinterpreted through a filter of expectation. This isn't dishonesty or imagination, it's context shaping cognition in measurable ways. Studies in human factors psychology consistently show that uncertainty increases pattern attribution. When people lack information, they fill gaps with inference. In environments like Area 51, where secrecy is explicit and institutional, the threshold for inference drops dramatically. Finally, administrative compartmentalization rather than physical separation. Programs may be described as separate not because they occupy different locations, but because they occupy different chains of authority and security clearances. Personnel may believe they're being taken to different facilities when they're actually being taken to different sections of the same complex under different administrative controls. This distinction matters in large installations where access points, security protocols, and internal routing can create the impression of multiple sites without requiring multiple sites to physically exist. After examining testimony, geography, documented logistics, military practice, psychology, and alternative explanations, we arrive at a place that's less dramatic than many would prefer, but far more important than simple answers. What remains unresolved isn't a single question about tunnels or railways. What remains unresolved is the boundary between what is known, what is unknown, and what may never be knowable within systems designed to maintain that exact ambiguity. S4 has never been independently verified. No declassified documents from any agency reference a facility officially designated as S4 at Papoose Lake. No construction records, environmental assessments, or budget allocations tied to such a site have surfaced publicly. No corroborating witness with overlapping access and verifiable credentials has come forward. This doesn't prove S4 doesn't exist, but it defines the evidentiary boundary clearly. As of now, S4 exists within testimony and interpretation, not documentation. Bob Lazar's account has neither collapsed nor been validated. It remains internally consistent, limited in scope, and resistant to expansion. He hasn't produced new evidence. He hasn't revised claims to accommodate new theories. He also hasn't been conclusively disproven. This places his testimony in an unusual category, where most false stories grow over time and most true stories eventually gain corroboration. Lazar's has done neither. It has remained static, unchanged, and unabsorbed into official history. The railway idea, by contrast, is more easily assessed. As this investigation has demonstrated, the underground railway narrative doesn't originate in primary testimony. It doesn't appear in declassified records. It doesn't align with documented military logistics practices. It persists not because it's supported, but because it's useful as explanation, as symbol, as a way to impose order on uncertainty. The railway doesn't represent a hidden system beneath the desert. It represents the human need to connect unseen dots when official channels refuse to provide that connection. What this reveals is something profound about how secrecy functions in democratic societies. The enduring power of Area 51 narratives doesn't come from what we know is hidden. It comes from what we know is withheld. There's a critical difference. Hidden implies discovery is possible through investigation. Withheld implies access is denied regardless of investigation. Area 51 occupies the second category. It's a reminder that some information is controlled indefinitely, not because it's supernatural or extraordinary, but because it's considered strategically sensitive. That reality is uncomfortable in societies built on principles of transparency and accountability. Discomfort seeks explanation. When official explanations stop or never begin, unofficial ones rush in to fill the vacuum. This doesn't mean all unofficial explanations are false. It means they operate under different rules, shaped by inference, analogy, and narrative necessity rather than documentation and verification. Understanding this distinction allows mystery to exist without distorting it through layers of unsupported assumption.
The most important lesson from examining the underground railway theory isn't about railways at all. It's about how human beings respond to institutional silence and how that response shapes belief over time. When governments maintain secrecy for legitimate reasons, national security, technological advantage, strategic deterrence, they create environments where speculation naturally flourishes. The challenge for investigators and the public is distinguishing between reasonable questions and unanswered assumptions, between evidence-based inquiry and narrative satisfaction. The railway theory demonstrates what happens when that distinction blurs. It began as a reasonable logistical question. How would materials move between restricted sites? It evolved into a speculative answer: underground transport systems. It solidified through repetition until many now treat it as established fact rather than unsupported hypothesis. This progression reveals something essential about how myths form in the modern era. They don't require conspiracy or coordination. They emerge organically through the interaction of human psychology, information scarcity, and the modern media landscape that rewards compelling narratives over careful qualification. What makes the Area 51 mythology particularly instructive is that it developed around a genuinely secret facility conducting genuinely classified work. The base was real, the secrecy was real, the advanced technology tested there was real. None of this required aliens or exotic physics. It required Cold War geopolitics, technological ambition, and institutional commitment to keeping adversaries uninformed. The exotic elements layered onto this foundation over decades tell us more about human nature than about what lies beneath the Nevada desert. We're pattern-seeking creatures. We're uncomfortable with unresolved narratives. We fill informational voids automatically, often without conscious awareness we're doing so. When these tendencies encounter environments of genuine secrecy, the results are predictable. Speculation becomes theory, theory becomes belief, belief becomes common knowledge. Each stage feels natural and justified, but the progression moves us steadily away from what can be demonstrated toward what feels satisfying. The discipline required to resist this progression is substantial. It means accepting uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary problem awaiting solution. It means distinguishing between what we'd like to know and what we can actually demonstrate. It means holding multiple possibilities in tension without prematurely resolving them in favor of the most compelling narrative. These are not natural cognitive behaviors. They require conscious effort and constant vigilance against our own built-in biases toward closure and pattern completion.
So where does this leave us? After tracing the railway idea from its absence in original testimony through its gradual emergence in speculation to its current status as widely assumed truth, what can we conclude? Not about what exists beneath the Nevada desert, but about how we know what we think we know and whether that knowledge is built on solid ground or comfortable assumptions. The most honest answer is this. We don't know whether S4 exists as described. We don't know what facilities, if any, operate near Papoose Lake. We don't know the full extent of infrastructure at Groom Lake or elsewhere in the Nevada test and training range. These are genuine unknowns, and treating them as such is not weakness, it's accuracy. What we do know is that the underground railway connecting these hypothetical facilities was never part of the original testimony that sparked these questions. It emerged later, through speculation, through the need to resolve logistical puzzles, through the assumption that extraordinary secrecy must involve extraordinary infrastructure. This distinction matters because it demonstrates how easily elements can be added to stories when those stories exist in environments of official silence. Once added, these elements become nearly impossible to remove from collective memory. They spread through repetition, they're reinforced through visual representation, they're defended by communities invested in comprehensive explanations, and they persist because they can never be definitively disproven, only recognized as unsupported. Bob Lazar described secrecy. He described compartmentalization. He described limited access to something he didn't fully understand. What he didn't describe was an underground railway. That addition came from elsewhere, from the very human need to complete an incomplete picture. Recognizing this doesn't resolve the mystery of Area 51 or validate or invalidate Lazar's core claims. It simply returns us to what was actually said, stripping away the layers that accumulated afterward. In the end, the hidden railway beneath Area 51 may be real, it may be misunderstood, or it may exist only as an answer to a question no one was allowed to ask, an answer we constructed ourselves in the silence that followed. The desert keeps its secrets. What we've learned is that sometimes the most persistent ideas in modern UFO history aren't about what's hidden in the sand, but about what's hidden in the gaps between what we're told and what we need to believe. And that revelation, uncomfortable as it may be, is where any serious investigation must ultimately rest, not in certainty, but in the disciplined acknowledgement of what remains genuinely unknown.